The Small Business Innovation Research Program is one way to bring commercial products into government. It's relatively fast and simple as long as you follow the rules. A new bid protest decision helps clarify those rules, and here to help us understand the decision is procurement attorney and partner at Haynes Boone, Zach Prince. Zach, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
So the Trump administration has been really clear about its intent to make government procurement move faster, be simpler, and bring more commercial-ready products into the government. You've got a story here about a protest that seems to add some clarity and maybe some caution about that process. Tell us about what you brought.
Sure. So as some background, this is about the Small Business Innovation Research Program, or SBIR. You'll hear everyone likes to pronounce their acronyms in government. The SBIR program is a great way for the government to do innovative research and development through small businesses. And there are three phases. The first is for feasibility, second is for prototyping, and the third is for commercializing the technology. It has to be some sort of outgrowth of what's been done under a prior phase, but phase 3 is very attractive for businesses because the government can award it on a sole source basis, which the government loves because they get to do things quickly and, in their view, efficiently. Business loves because they now have arguably a captive customer. And importantly, phase 3 awards do not have to be to small businesses. They have to be to the entity that received the phase 1 and phase 2. So it had to be small at that time, but not necessarily at phase 3. And that makes them attractive targets, companies that have phase 1 and phase 2 for acquisitions. This I see all the time. If you've got a really interesting phase 2 project that you did, larger businesses might look at you and say, well, now we have a great opportunity to invest in this company and get all this phase 3 work. So I do a lot of acquisition work. This comes up constantly.
That makes a lot of sense, but it also seems like it's open to interpretation and potentially protest.
Yes. So this is the tricky part. There's not a lot of guidance there really aren't any regulations. There's the statute that authorizes the SBIR program, and then there's the SBA's directives that give some color and fleshes out some of the definitions, but there's still a lot of gaps. So it becomes this big open question. What really, in fact, extends from, derives from, or completes an effort under a prior SBIR or SBIR funding agreement? That's what was at issue in this protest. And it was a fairly convoluted protest with some really interesting wrinkles and I think some clear takeaways. But tell me, how would you like to tackle this one?
Well, set the stage a little bit. Tell us this was the Air Force, right? The Air Force was buying a technological solution, and the people that they bought it from were not the original people that they started with, I think is how I understand it.
That's right. That's a good framing. So the Air Force had a requirement for a tactical security system that was providing ground-based security and surveillance capability, assisting security forces in remote deployment locations. They had gone through a prior round of purchases for a version of what they referred to as a TSS, or tactical security system, where they had determined that another company, Digital Force, offered just such a system. But that was a different system. It was a different procurement, and when they reapproached it, the Air Force's requirements shifted. They put out a RFI, a request for information, for their new requirements for a new TSS system. There were 14 vendors who responded. The agency went through a few rounds with the RFI process and discussions, and they determined that 2 of those entities could be eligible for SBIR Phase 3, SBIR Phase 3 awards, based on prior work they had done under Phase 2. The agency decided that's the right way to proceed. And just as an aside, the agency arguably had to do that, because if there is work that derives from a Phase 2 project, the agency has to award it on a sole source basis to a company that had done that Phase 2 work. This has also been protested. It's not an issue in this one. But if the agency decided we should have an open competition, it's very likely and very reasonable that the ultimate awardee here would have protested that decision too.
So you can't win whichever way you go, but the Air Force did award it, and they got protested. So actually they got protested twice.
They did. So the first time when the agency said, well, we're going to issue awards to 2 different eligible entities, There was a protest first at the agency level and then GAO, brought by the same company, Digital Force Technologies. They had a lot of arguments, but they really came down in a lot of ways to the argument that this technology, the procurement being acquired, the procurement at issue, did not derive from, extend, or complete the efforts from a previous award. The agency level protest, the agency disagreed. At GAO, the agency said, we're going to take corrective action and clarify some things. So the agency went back. They said, we're just going to award to one company, not two. And we think it very clearly shows that what we're buying now derives from that SBIR Phase 2 that was performed by ClearAlign, who's the awardee here. And then, of course, Digital Force protested again.
I'm speaking with procurement attorney Zach Prince, a partner at Haynes Boone. All right, Zach, so GAO finally ruled on this, and you think there's some important takeaways from what they determined?
Yeah, so the first I would note is just the agencies have so much discretion, and GAO noted this more than once in the decision, to determine whether a Phase 3 is appropriate. That is, whether the technology they're purchasing really derives from, extends, or completes efforts from a prior award. There's a lot of subjectivity there. And the agency, if they make a reasonable decision, which doesn't mean the decision you would make, it means just a decision that stands scrutiny, that wins. The agency gets that discretion. So the agency, even if not everything they're buying derives from a prior effort, but some core aspect of the current buy derives from a prior phase, that's enough. And the agency is going to win in that scenario. The argument here that Digital Force made from that point was that really only one part of this overall system derived from a prior phase of the procurement. Everything else was a commercial off-the-shelf item. It's in the phrasing of Digital Force, you've taken a bunch of COTS items from off the shelf and you've combined them together with this one thing that you developed previously. That's not enough to make it a continuation of the Phase 2 work. That's not right. The GAO disagreed. The agency is just going to have the finger pressed heavily on the scale in favor of its determination, as long as it documented it and it was reasonable. The second point, which I've grappled with before, and this has driven me a little bit crazy, you've got this idea, government contracts can't be assigned, right? There's a statute, this has been the case for a very long time, unless the government consents through something called an innovation process, or through some sort of implied consent, or if there's what's called an assignment by operation of law. I'm not going to go too far down in the weeds on that here. That could be an hour plus of its own discussion. But for the SBIR program, the directive from SBA has said that you have to be the entity that held the prior SBIR phase or a successor in interest. And they didn't define what successor in interest means. And so a very cautious perspective would have been to say successor in interest means that you are the entity that has had a novation of a prior government contract, or you've otherwise totally acquired that prior entity, not assets, stocks, or through a merger. It has become de facto the same as the current entity. That I thought had been a challenging position because the government might not always accept it. I've often had butted heads with government folks who have not quite appreciated some of the corporate law nuances here. What was startling to me about this GAO decision, the Air Force looked at this and they said, well, the company that we're awarding to had bought all of the intellectual property assets of the prior SBIR contract holder. That is an asset sale, not, in fact, a full stock sale. They haven't merged that entity into this other entity. It's just they bought the IP. And that is enough for the SBIR program to become the successor in interest. That is a very broad interpretation. I think it's the right interpretation, particularly because there really is not any guidance. So what that means is the agency gets a ton of deference. GAO gave the agency a ton of deference. So as long as they've got a plausible interpretation, that wins. And so here the determination was the awardee was the successor in interest because of this asset acquisition.
Those seem like a couple of pretty clear principles to take away. One, that as long as the agency is doing its best to make a good decision here, they get deference and preference, and that especially in today's world, the sale of IP is enough to create that continuity from level 2 to level 3.
At least as long as it's all of the IP. I think that was an important point, is that they bought everything, really, from the prior entity. And so the prior entity does technically still exist as far as I understand, but it was something more than just we're buying one isolated bit of IP that you've developed. I don't know where that line ends, but I think it's going to be up to agencies to decide on their own.
Well, this seems like a really useful premise for agencies as they're thinking about speeding up acquisition and buying those commercial products, to remember these two principles as they move forward. So, Zach, thanks for bringing us this story today.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
Procurement attorney Zach Prince is a partner at Haynes Boone. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.